In 1973, a military coup shattered Chile's democracy in 11 brutal hours. Salvador Allende lay dead in La Moneda Palace. General Augusto Pinochet seized power with tanks rolling through Santiago's streets. The world watched a nation break. What they didn't see was the laboratory that would rise from the ashes. Hidden in the chaos was an economic experiment decades in the making. American professors, CIA operatives, and Chilean students had been preparing for this moment since the 1950s. The coup wasn't just about politics. It was about testing a radical new vision of capitalism on an entire nation. The laboratory had a name, the Chicago Boys. The funding had a source, American intelligence. The cost would be measured in more than money. This is another video where money, power, and history collide. Nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The story begins with what everyone thought they knew. In the 1970s, Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago returned home to implement free market reforms. They privatized industries, cut government spending, and opened markets to foreign investment. Milton Friedman called it an economic miracle. The world called it the Chilean model. The surface narrative was clean and simple. Brilliant economists rescued a failing economy through pure academic theory. Capitalism defeated socialism. Markets triumphed over central planning. The Chicago School proved that freedom and prosperity were the same thing. This version of events dominated headlines, academic papers, and policy discussions for decades. Chile became the poster child for neoliberal economics. Other nations copied its reforms. The model spread across Latin America, Eastern Europe, and beyond. The reality was far more complex and infinitely darker. The mechanism began in 1955 with a seemingly innocent academic exchange program. The University of Chicago partnered with Chile's Catholic University to train Chilean economists in American universities. The Ford Foundation provided the initial funding. The State Department offered quiet support. The program was called the Chile Project. Over 2 decades, more than 150 Chilean students studied at Chicago and other American universities. They absorbed the teachings of Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, and other free market evangelists. They learned to worship efficiency, distrust government, and treat human behavior as a series of market transactions. The students who returned to Chile weren't just economists. They were missionaries carrying a new religion of market fundamentalism back to their homeland. The CIA watched this intellectual pipeline with growing interest. By the 1960s, American intelligence agencies were pouring millions into Chilean universities, think tanks, and research centers. They funded scholarships, conferences, and academic publications. They built networks of influence that stretched from university classrooms to government ministries. The agency didn't just fund education. They shaped it. CIA money flowed through front organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the Inter-American Foundation. Academic programs emphasized American economic models. Research projects promoted free market solutions to Chilean problems. Textbooks taught students to see capitalism as natural law rather than political choice. When Salvador Allende won the 1970 presidential election, the laboratory was already prepared. The Chicago Boys had spent 15 years building intellectual infrastructure for a free market revolution. They had plans, personnel, and political connections. They needed only opportunity. The CIA provided more than opportunity. They orchestrated it. American intelligence spent over $8 million destabilizing Allende's government. They funded opposition parties, sponsored propaganda campaigns, and supported economic sabotage. They turned Chile's economy into a weapon against its own democracy. Strikes paralyzed the nation. Inflation soared. Political violence erupted in the streets. The chaos was carefully cultivated. The CIA needed Chile to fail spectacularly under socialism. Only then could they prove that capitalism was the sole alternative to economic collapse and political anarchy. The coup delivered that proof in the most violent terms possible. Within hours of Pinochet's victory, the Chicago Boys emerged from the shadows. They presented the new military government with a comprehensive economic plan called the BRIC. The document outlined radical free market reforms that would transform every aspect of Chilean society. It was 500 pages of pure market fundamentalism, wrapped in the language of national salvation. The BRIC wasn't written after the coup. It was prepared years in advance with CIA funding and American academic support. The plan waited in bank vaults while democracy died in the streets. Pinochet embraced the Chicago Boys because their economics matched his politics. Free markets required authoritarian control. Competition demanded the elimination of opposition. Efficiency meant the destruction of unions, political parties, and civil society organizations that might resist economic transformation. The laboratory opened for business in 1975 when Chile implemented the most radical free market reforms in human history. The government privatized everything from telephone companies to pension systems. It eliminated trade barriers, deregulated financial markets, and slashed social spending. It treated the nation as a testing ground for theories that had never been tried on such a massive scale. The results were as brutal as they were profitable. Unemployment reached 30%. Industrial production collapsed. Real wages fell by 40%. The Chilean economy contracted more severely than during the Great Depression. The Chicago Boys called this shock therapy. They insisted that short-term pain would produce long-term prosperity. They had theory on their side. They also had tanks. The human cost of the experiment was staggering. Pinochet's regime killed over 3,000 people and tortured tens of thousands more. Political opposition was eliminated through murder, exile, and imprisonment. The laboratory required absolute control over its test subjects. The economic violence was equally systematic. Chile's middle class was destroyed as social services disappeared and secure employment became extinct. The nation's industrial capacity was dismantled in favor of raw material exports. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, while millions fell into poverty. The Chicago Boys treated this suffering as necessary data. They measured success through macroeconomic indicators while ignoring human consequences. Growth rates mattered more than suicide rates. Market efficiency trumped social stability. By the early 1980s, the laboratory was failing catastrophically. A financial crisis triggered by deregulated banks destroyed Chile's economy for the second time in a decade. The Chicago Boys fled to American universities and international organizations. Pinochet imposed emergency economic controls that violated every principle of free market orthodoxy. The experiment should have ended in acknowledged failure. Instead, it was rebranded as a stunning success. The mechanism of this transformation revealed the true power of intellectual infrastructure. American economists, journalists, and policymakers simply ignored the failures while amplifying the modest successes. They credited free markets for Chile's eventual recovery while blaming external shocks for its repeated collapses. They treated the dictatorship as irrelevant to economic outcomes while insisting that democracy was impossible without capitalism. The Chilean model became a global export product. The same economists who designed Chile's experiment advised governments in Poland, Russia, and Iraq. The same policies that destroyed Chile's economy were imposed on nations across the developing world. The same organizations that funded the Chicago Boys promoted structural adjustment programs that transformed the global economy. The laboratory had succeeded beyond its creators' wildest dreams. Not because it had proven free market theories correct, but because it had demonstrated that any economic model could be made to appear successful with sufficient intellectual resources and political control. The names have changed, but the behavior continues. Today's Silicon Valley entrepreneurs sound remarkably like yesterday's Chicago Boys when they propose to disrupt entire industries through technological solutions to social problems. Modern crypto evangelists echo the same market fundamentalism that the CIA promoted in 1970s Chile. Contemporary think tanks funded by tech billionaires operate according to principles perfected by Cold War intelligence agencies. The laboratory model has evolved rather than disappeared. Special economic zones in China implement capitalist experiments within communist political systems. Startup accelerators treat cities as testing grounds for technological disruption. International development organizations continue to impose economic theories on unwilling populations. The intellectual infrastructure remains intact and operational. The same universities that trained the Chicago Boys now produce the architects of surveillance capitalism. The same foundations that funded Chilean experiments now promote artificial intelligence research with military applications. The same consulting firms that designed structural adjustment programs now advise governments on digital transformation initiatives. The methods have been refined through decades of practice. Modern influence operations use social media algorithms instead of academic conferences. Contemporary propaganda flows through podcast networks rather than university presses. Today's regime change operations employ economic warfare rather than military coups. The fundamental logic persists across all these transformations. Powerful interests fund intellectual movements that provide theoretical justification for their political objectives. Academic institutions provide legitimacy for policies that serve elite interests. Crisis creates opportunities to implement radical changes that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The Chilean laboratory proved that any social experiment becomes acceptable when it carries the proper intellectual credentials and operates under emergency conditions. The lesson has been learned and applied repeatedly across the globe. The people who design these experiments never live in the laboratories they create. The Chicago Boys returned to comfortable academic positions, while Chileans paid the price for their theories. Today's tech entrepreneurs promote digital disruption from gated communities, while workers bear the costs of automation. The architects of economic transformation consistently exempt themselves from the consequences of their innovations. The greatest success of the Chilean laboratory was not economic, but intellectual. It established the principle that human societies could be treated as experimental subjects for testing abstract theories. It normalized the use of crisis as justification for implementing radical changes without democratic consent. It demonstrated that academic credentials could transform political projects into technical solutions. The laboratory model has become the dominant approach to social change in the modern world. Every crisis becomes an opportunity for experimentation. Every theory becomes a potential policy. Every population becomes a potential test subject. The Chilean experiment revealed a truth that its sponsors never intended to prove. The people who control the flow of ideas don't need to control the flow of money to reshape the world. They just need to convince others that their theories are natural laws rather than political choices.